So there's something we're missing here, right? Um, for instance, when somebody has a love affair with themselves, right, and they love to live within the confines of their own thoughts, and they begin to think that everyone else is their enemy, and in fact, they could prove this because that is the world that they live in, of, and by. And it's you're hard pressed to prove that this doesn't actually exist, especially today when you look at, Schadenfreude, psychopathy. But as to say that you think Ronald Reagan was a great guy, huh? You're hailing back to the 1980s and think, wow, what a just person. But then what you're missing is Nancy Reagan and her love of fellatio and the fact that she was known all around town in this sort of star-set circle, this celebrity, as the one who gave great head. Okay, and so you kind of have to look at Ronald Reagan in a much different light at that point, right? And then his need to come into power, and then really his lack thereof to really effectively change anything. But he did make a really good, I'm going to paraphrase, he made a really good statement as how would we think, how would we be, how would we interact with one another if we came up upon, an imminent alien threat that the only way we could survive is through this sort of collectivism of coming back together, right? And so even with Chris Bledsoe, right, and his loss of his first wife, how he found her, how she was so mangled up, how he started to stand behind this sort of divine feminine or this Sophia energy, but all to do what? Really, you look at him and he brags there about owning over 100 houses, being at the top of, his real estate mogul empire, right? And the only way you can get there at that time is with raw male force and energy. So what you're really seeing is you're seeing this exposure to the lady as a manifestation of what he really wants. And when he's given everything that he wants, right? I think he's being made more of an example of. And then the homoerotic element, right? So what we, with the lady, right? That this lady causes a homoerotic experience that is really beyond borderline psychical rape, right? That these people didn't ask for this, didn't want this. Or is this expounding a morphic resonant field that people are largely unaware of and are sort of discounting of this shadow self, right? And that in possibly Atlantis, Lemuria, this became the item at hand. This became the main issue. That through telekinetic abilities, that is, language models that asserted a movement process and an interaction with, a certain teleology, right? Began to manifest as to take shape or form, right? That people were beginning to change their directive and their purpose because of an ignorance that came about oddly, right? You have such an amassment of technological prowess and energy, and that when human beings were designed, it was to take away that elongated skull extra chakra to where now in the human flesh, this does not exist. You're going to have to invent this, and only the worthy will be able to come up into this, right? So the people who are leading today that think that they are selected, and they are in fact at the head of the caste system, that are becoming more filled with temerity and hubris by the day, and really believe that they are selected by this entity. Well, that's a specific entity that they've chosen, and this may not be. So in other words, it's almost like our gods really are ourselves, a juxtaposed position to ourselves, and an echo chamber that don't breed love. It doesn't go back to a collectivism. It doesn't go back to the health and total lack of toxicity to where we're able to communicate on a scale where we're not assaulting and polluting one another. And I think that most of the information out here today is really pointing at this. And you know, for you to assume, let's just assume that all of a sudden everybody was able to telepathically communicate with one another with clear and pure, indistinguishable purpose, where you could hear, but you could also feel the intentions behind that other person, right? And when we all go into this, right, we're either living halfway in a half truth of ourselves, and only half of us is communicating, while the other shadow self is standing behind this, right? And eventually, at some point in this process, is going to emerge, and then you're going to have this dark figure that's kind of a duality, right? That might even fractionate and break up into more personas, more personalities, right? Or you have people who are giving off a very weak impulse and don't enjoy it and would rather live sort of the Stoic philosophy of, you know, but I mean, if you get into true Stoicism, the Stoic would say, right, we have telepathic communication. We don't question it. We use it to the best of our ability. We develop this to its highest extent, but we still stay at our station. Now, don't you see that you can't do that because you're defining your station? So it gets into this teleology. It gets into this phenomenon and noumenon. It gets into your Welt and your Weltanschauung and your worldview. But it gets into something much deeper, right? Where the end-all goal is a matrix or a matrices, a vortex or a vortex of a toroidal field that is missing a very important element. And that is that if we are divine creators and we lost our way and we fell into sort of a commercialization or an aesthetic aspect of this, where we just wanted to live as gods and we were no longer creators. In other words, we were living in our own echo chambers, and eventually generation after generation. And when I say generation, that's very loosely said, because you really kind of have to look at the Sumerians and go, how far back was Atlantis? Like the story of Atlantis, like, was this a story through oral tradition that was carried on, right, eventually, that really harkened back to this Mesopotamian, Sumerian line of people that could regenerate themselves. And there's even talk about that several times, not just in the Emerald Tablets, but in several different ways. And I think that's why Hermes Trismegistus and Prometheus become these very intriguing figures, along with Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and of course Noah's Ark, and this depiction or this reinterpretation, this retelling of an age-old story, right? Of when you put all this together, you're missing a particular element that is highly important to place back into and infuse with the fact that what would you be if you had unstoppable potential, right? And you see that eventually the only thing that gets in your way is other people. The only thing that gets in your way of achieving this soul state of God status is the fact that you have others that are more developed and more capable from a psychokinetic sense, from a psionic sense, from a telepathic sense, telekinetic sense, who may have been doing a lot of the work with their minds and moving objects, and that there wasn't this sort of stalemate or dead end or cap placed on how we might go about expressing these abilities or capabilities, And if there weren't built into the matrix around us a heavy filtration system that only allowed certain people to sort of knock on that door and use this to a certain conditional state, heightened conditional state, where they were held to only go so far with their telepathic or telekinetic capabilities, right? Until somebody realized that by amassing more energy, right, that by interplaying with this spiritual quanta is what I used to call it, that bridge on this techne, this technology, as to say that, yeah, I mean, we get into philosophical concepts because this is largely what is spoken about and talked around, right? Even when you get into the discussions with Nietzsche and the Ubermensch or the Overman, that you have this person that's undeniably like, what's left? Ubermensch, Overman is not going to be the most physically strong, okay? Because this is just a physical status of being. It's an acceptance of this is my upper limit, right? Is not going to be even the heightened state of a political leader. What do we have next? And it's kind of like we're being shown that out in the open by people who are using pure psychopathic and sociopathic technologies, right? That this is a technology, but it's not a working algorithm that can last, that can stand the test of time. In other words, there's a breakdown process when you talk about, accretion, attrition, but more so cellular death, that there isn't a generating aspect to this because the huge oversight is the fact, like the fountain of youth and how it's alluded to, right? Or the Ark of the Covenant, right? Other allusions to this type of energy, even in hieroglyphics, right? Egyptian hieroglyphics, as to say that this energy, that the universe itself or the cosmos is dark and deep as it may seem, like a lotus flower, like a cymatic regenerational return, right? That memory has agencies, that morphic resonance is a part of that agency. When you kind of combine Sheldrake with Dr. Michael Levin's research, you start to come out with some very profound things. But then you add in Hameroff and Penrose's work with aromatic amino acids, geometrical constructs and structures, the interplay of light. You reintroduce thermodynamic properties into this conditional state, and you begin to see how form follows function, function into form. Are we not put into a certain form to exhibit a certain function, and that there is a definite telomere and pineal gland cap on top of this, right? That we possibly have to turn toward one another, and there may have to be a very ardent, stringent, selective process, which has to be done in a very highly ontological and perspicacious measure, as to now that we don't have these elongated skulls, that we have been fashioned in such a way to where we have to work together, that an existential component of a missing organelle that completes us now has to be used as a fully developed device, right? In order to acquiesce or ascertain a full connection, a language distribution, right? Through who is going to be able to use. So you almost look at, like, strangely, or, you have Eyes Wide Shut by Tom Cruise, but then you also have Minority Report, right? And you have these oracles, right? And you have, so I'm not going to get into that whole story. And then you also have Oblivion that Tom Cruise was in. And these are all, you have to understand that we can't accept the covert aspects of Scientology. If we're going to go into this, we can't be told what to do, that the decision is ultimately ours as a collective, and that there's something very diabolical happening here, to where most people didn't even know how rich and how many people were involved, like Hal Puthoff, involved with Scientology. So you have this connection with a populist caste system, right? that is posturing itself as being above, as being greater than the average everyday plebeian or proletariat. And many people, this is like the stories of Heracles, to some extent, Solomon, right? To where, and Babylonian magic and so forth. The study of Horus and where Aleister Crowley was getting to this, right? But I believe he relented to the Sophia that became the material aspect of wisdom, or the physical wisdom that brought people down in the first place. In other words, we reach this height over and over again, right? Is Scientology connected to something greater than its surface level presupposition? Is it this diabolical, strange televangelistic capitulation mechanism that forces people to bow down to it, and is only proselytizing to those who obviously were open to the downloads, saw themselves as highly important, and wanted to reach this God status, and everybody else is left out and therefore slaves? Or is there a collective place that we get to where we reach this hierarchy of thought that isn't even prevalent here, so to speak, and to transfer our consciousness into that and begin to think on such a higher scale that we are now seeing the implications that we have to be able to vet one another. We have to be able to trust one another. If there's going to be these downloads, therefore this open line of communication with one another, right? And you begin to see a different side to people like Nikola Tesla or even Tom Cruise. Like, is Tom Cruise capable of telepathic communication? Does he really register off the charts? You know, is John Travolta? Did they go through this process? I mean, a lot of people forget, but there was like a weeks-long supposed affair in Hawaii that you might be hard-pressed to even find today. I don't even know if you could, but it was on all the tabloids going back into like the 1990s that people sort of shoved it off with the National Enquirer, where John Travolta and Tom Cruise were supposedly seen in an outright relationship with one another, right? So you see Clinton in the blue dress, you see all these implications, but this implicit of having to work through the dark shadow aspects of ourselves to realize that this had to be sort of purged out, right? And that in order for there to be a clear communication, telepathic communication, in order for us to, again, achieve this sort of purification, we had to walk with the marring and the scars of what was really there, fully existent in those shadow realms of the shadow self. And that when when it's available and fully open, this telepathic communication, these airways that could lead us anywhere and into any possibility, anything, that really point at an ability to create a construct of a worldview, a Welt, into a Weltanschauung, right? The world and the worldview. That if we were seeing ourselves as capable of agitating, aggressing at certain times, right? When we talk about thermodynamics, and then acquisitioning and acquiring energies within ourselves, that's sort of orgone energy. If you want to look into that, it's very interesting. These Faraday cages, certain people that were pronounced as charlatans and so forth. But when you really look at the technology, instead of looking at the technology and discounting it, you really had to look into the hearts of men and what their true intentions are among other men, knowing that they have this power, feeling the power surge through them, and then to look at your brother or your sister and to go that this power surges to a lesser extent within them. Do I elevate them and instruct them to come up to my level like a true practitioner, an egalitarian, right? Or do I amass this energy, hide this energy, not even disclose that I have this energy with the pure Schadenfreude intention that builds within me to become the God and to overthrow everyone and to start my own world, right? And so you see how the sociopath, most likely, and the Schadenfreudistic aspects of the dark aspects of a soul really came to be, because there was this fractionation where you then had a duality, so very much like Freud's id, ego, superego, right? And very much akin to the Animus and the Animus by Carl Jung, to where you see these constructs, right? Or Plutchik's wheel, right, with emotionality, and then on into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the things that we require, and that he added transcendence at the later on to this pyramid, Maslow's construct of hierarchy of needs, and that ultimately transcendence had to be there. Transcend into what? Now we have fully disclosed in front of us whether or not how we interplay with that, and it really we think that we're experiencing this lady, right? Those who have come into the experience of it, some of them say, "Oh, it was a whole homoerotic, strange thing that happened to me." Others say, "Yeah, she's holy like Chris Bledsoe, but she did attempt to murder a dog, and then, but was she trying to murder the dog or display this? Was that really coming from Chris Bledsoe's unmet capacity to be able to think about the entire mimetic chain that he was putting out there, that you want to be a hero, you want to be holy, but there's still that dark, ambitious trump within you that just wants to acquire real estate, that just wants to be a god amongst men. And now that you have passively placed on a pedestal, right, your first wife and the loss of her, and to find her in this terrible condition where you didn't even recognize her when you saw that she was the victim of this particular accident on that road that you drive on every single day in that town that I think you were raised within. What does that shadow self really look like? So it's actually an echo chamber where it's giving you the energy that you are producing before you. And we're all stuck in that echo chamber right now. Like people who think that they're just going along with their everyday lives and that they somehow are achieving success, but they're living according to these Stoic traditions, and they're not really good people. They're hiding behind the physical aspect that doesn't even exist. They're creating a wall of their own make, their own echo, or what I like to refer to it as a fart chamber, right? To where they all they care about is the man money, and if this is the money, if this is the boons that are offered to me in this current time and status, I want to have more of that. But I also want to appear like I'm this benevolent, awesome person. So there's this casting of a false self, the hero, right? The celebrity. And we have to work beyond these constructs of the Joseph Campbell, like where he was looking at mythology and really taking this apart, where is this where it ends, like the hero's journey? But it never seems to end really well, right? Because if you take the story, and I'm not going to go off on a byline here, but if you take the story of Luke Skywalker, he becomes this very, not in a good way, a very pietous person, right? Where he now thinks that he is outdone, right, Darth Vader, his father, but he hasn't gone through a fraction of the power and the command, but also all of the trials and tribulations that Anakin Skywalker had to go through. He wasn't born with the same abilities and the same capacity. He didn't train. He wasn't picked, right? He was just the last one left. And then it gets into this strange aspect, you know, when you go on with Star Wars, where it started to lose, you know, the Rogue, Rogue One or whatever it was called, which is a terrible movie, but, or The Last Jedi, you get into this area of information that's a harbinger back to what Jason Riza Georgiani talks about with this black magic sort of Amazonian cult, right? That these which was predominantly female, right? So you have these benefactors where they're looking at the information. The information still exists within them. They were coy and cautious enough to sit back while everybody else is destroying themselves. They were collected in their coteries and their covens as to know when to shrink back and know how to divisively keep track of certain spells, rituals, right, incantations, right, and that this information was passed on probably through the Ophites, the worship of Cain, right? But really, what's left out is you see that the line of Cain through Tubal-Cain, and when you look at the procession of this lineage, right, and the generations thereof, what you fail to look at is the fact that now fully embraced is this cult of witchcraft using and employing the methods of seduction, using makeup, using a false persona, right? And really this emergence of a character like Tiamat, Hathor, Lilith, Eve, on into all these other, the Lady of the Wood, that this lady emerges over and over again that isn't the highest power, isn't the ruling power, but somehow has lasted through the test of time, right? Because she was, it was overlooked, her capacity and her ability to be able to acquisition and acquiesce and play the field in such a way that she never looked at Nancy Reagan and the implications that she was implicit in the rise and the fall of Ronald Reagan, that this entity was fully able to exist through Nancy Reagan. That's what we're getting at. That this singular head witch of this coterie was in fact involved with John Gardner and Wicca and the establishment of Wicca and the worship of the goddess. That this female element has existed, can transpose itself or herself, but that is she, Sophia, the guardian at the gate, not getting off on over these massive number of years of regeneration, is she standing there at the gate to say that man is going to ultimately follow into his own echo chamber, even after you speak the truth, even after you are in search of the truth. So we get into this holy grail and this fountain of youth, which is, if you aren't stuck in your own echo chamber and you have more to lose, in other words, Chris Bledsoe has to lose his false self at the gate. And perhaps that's what he's seeing, that he can't really display or talk about the intricacies that are occurring with him, but that he is stalemating time and time again in the hubris and the temerity of the self, right? And that ultimately anyone who's going to walk beyond this point and go back into the ability to be able to go about using and accessing, acquiescing, right, these telekinetic, telepathic abilities, has to understand before you travel through that gate that if you are experiencing anything that is the refraction of this echo chamber of making love to yourself, that's what we're really getting at, right? And then ultimately facing that, just like Luke Skywalker having to face himself when Yoda, I think it was The Empire Strikes Back, I could be wrong, where Yoda is training him. What was that? The Hoth or something? I don't remember all the intricate details, but there you have that. This was heavily influenced by Joseph Campbell as well. The mythological, the quest of the hero, the hero's journey, but that he would be fighting Darth Vader, and then when he chops his head off and the mask is unveiled, it's actually him that he was fighting all along,